What if Kyiv, the mother of cities, wasn't destined for eternal glory, but for fire and ruin? After Yaroslav the Wise, rival princes tore Rus apart, even as merchants traded silver and furs while war drums echoed. Then came the unstoppable storm of Mongol horsemen, reshaping history forever. From the ashes, a new power slowly rose in the northern forests. Welcome back to the deep chapter where every fall hides the seed of a new beginning. Now, let's get into it.
A wind whipped across the steppes as the old Grand Prince of Kiev lay dying. He was Yaroslav Vladimirovich the Wise, and under his rule in the early 11th century, Kievan Rus had been a shining, vibrant realm. Its spires and golden domes glittered from the White Sea to the Black Sea. Trade caravans brought silk from the east and silks, and furs from the north, making Kiev a magnet of wealth and culture. But as Yaroslav breathed his last in February 1054, he cast a long shadow. His death marked the beginning of Kievan Rus's decline, as a half-centurial golden age gave way to long rivalries and fragmentation. Power passed to his eldest son, Iseoslav, and soon Kiev's royal kin were quarreling bitterly over the throne. Instead of a peaceful succession, the state splintered into dukedoms, the very system Yaroslav had encouraged. The rota, or seniority system, could not hold them together, and the grand city of Kiev began to lose its preeminence. Within a century, chroniclers note, the Kievan state began to decline in the late 11th century, gradually disintegrating into various rival regional powers throughout the 12th century. Without Yaroslav's steady hand, each son carved out his own fief. Izyaslav in Kiev, Sviatoslav in Chernigov, Vizavald in Pereyaslav, and others taking towns like Novgorod, Smolensk, Ryazan, and beyond. These Rurikid princes were heirs of the state, but they often ruled like independent kings. They even made diplomacy grander than before. Yaroslav's daughters married into European royal families, becoming queens of Norway, Hungary, and France. But at home, the peace was shattered. Succession fights became chronic. As one modern historian puts it, power passing from father to son after 1054 became mired in a succession battle that lasted through several rulers until 1240. When Mongols attacked Kiev, in other words, for nearly 2 centuries after Yaroslav's death, rival Rus princes essentially fought over who would wear Kiev's crown. Princes built walls and monasteries, and cities still buzzed with life. Under Yaroslav, Kiev had become a center of learning and faith. He founded the majestic St. Sophia Cathedral in 1037 and sponsored the first Old East Slavic chronicle in literature. Peasants tilled the rich black earth fields along the Dnieper, and merchants from Scandinavia to Byzantium plied the river trade routes, but the political glue was gone. By the time of the 1180s, towns like Novgorod in the north, Vladimir Suzdal in the northeast, and Galicia Volhynia in the southwest, and the Crimea and Chernigov in between, operated increasingly as separate principalities, each under its own duke. Imagine a wandering minstrel in 1185, singing of these times, the epic tale of Igor's campaign, a real old Rus poem, tells of Prince Igor's ill-fated war against steppe tribes and includes a powerful plea to the warring princes to unite against the Turkic East. That poem, written in Old East Slavic, paints a vivid picture. Cities ringed with forest, onion-domed churches, and peoples feeling the pull of their native forests and rivers, yet divided by petty feuds. It appeals to patriotism, to Mother Rus, urging unity in the face of the constant threat from the Turkic East. But in reality, the princes answered discordantly. Then the storm came from beyond the horizon. In 1223, Mongol horsemen, Tatars, as Rus chronicles called them, appeared on the northern Black Sea steppes. 2 Mongol generals, Jib and Subutai, had chased fleeing enemies into the Caucasus and toward the Rus. On May 31, 1223, at the shallow Kalka River, in what is now eastern Ukraine, the Mongol vanguard met a hastily assembled coalition of Rus princes and their Cuman Palavsian allies. The Rus armies were under Prince Mstislav the Bold of Galicia Volhynia and Prince Mstislav III of Kiev, among others. The fighting was terrible and swift. Archers poured volleys of arrows that darkened the sky. The Mongol cavalry swept forward, and Rus troops found themselves encircled on the riverbank. In those few hours, the flower of the Rus army was destroyed. Chronicles later mourned that only 1 in 10 of those soldiers escaped back home. All the great nobles who fought that day, most of the assembled princes, were killed or captured, their blood soaking the grasses by the Kalka River. It was a shock. Rus had met an enemy with seemingly supernatural speed and strategy, and it ended in a decisive Mongol victory. The Mongols did not stay after this victory. They had achieved their reconnaissance. But they left a rumor of doom in their wake, confirming what Igor's poet had feared. 2 decades later, nothing would be left to rumor. In 1237, the full might of the Mongol Empire swept out of the Asian steppes under Batu Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan. They had prepared carefully. Batu's armies first crushed the Volga Bulgars in 1236. Then in late 1237 rolled down the Oke River Valley into the Rus lands. The first great city to face them was Ryazan, near Moscow. From the frozen north, Batu's horsemen descended like a winter gale. After only 5 days of siege in December 1237, Ryazan fell, its walls battered down and almost all its people slaughtered. No one inside was spared. Word of Ryazan's fate sent fear through neighboring principalities. The Mongols pressed on in successive winter campaigns. In the bitter cold of 1237 to 1238, they swept through Vladimir's Ozdal, the land of the Grand Prince Yuri II, battering its cities one after another. At the Battle of the Sit River in March 1238, Yuri himself was killed and his army destroyed, virtually wiping out the ruling house of Suzdal. Moscow itself, then just a village with a wooden fortress, was abandoned by its prince. By spring, they had taken major towns like Vladimir and Suzdal, crushing the strongest bulwark of the Rus north. Meanwhile, in the west, the southwestern principality of Galisheval-Hynia tried to hold out, but Batu's generals pursued survivors into the Carpathians. Then, in the late autumn of 1239, the Mongols turned their attention south, toward the ancient capital. Kyiv, cradle of Rus Christianity and culture, endured a desperate defense. Batu Khan himself arrived with siege engines and fiery arrows. Month after month, in 1240, the Grand Prince of Kiev, Michael of Chernigov, tried to fend them off. He lit beacons on the city walls so distant townsfolk would join in prayer. But it was no use. On December 6, 1240, the walls of Kiev finally crumbled under the horde. Historian accounts paint the scene. Batu's warriors surged in, and the great city of Kiev was given to the flames and slaughter. According to the French chronicler Guillaume de Rubruck and others who visited a few years later, Kiev was in ruins. No more than 200 houses remained amid countless bones and skulls on the roads. Virtually every building of any significance was gone. The cathedral's gilded crosses lay scorched on the ground. This brutal sack is generally held to mark the end of Kievan Rus as a cohesive state. By 1241, the dust had settled, and the Mongols retreated, satisfied with conquest and plunder. In just 3 years, they had overrun the heartlands of Rus, Ryazan, Vladimir Chernigov, Pereyaslav, and many more fell. Kiev's fall was the final blow. Many smaller towns and villages, too, had been destroyed or emptied of people. Everywhere, survivors sobbed amid the smoking ruins, burying their dead in mass graves. What once had been a relatively unified medieval realm was now a patchwork of shattered lands. And yet, life for ordinary people went on, eerily unchanged in some ways. Fields still needed plowing and sowing, birch bark letters still told of debts in Novgorod's markets. Orthodox priests still chanted services in burnt-out churches. The Mongols, surprisingly, did not directly rule Rus with soldiers and governors as they did in Persia or China. Instead, their yoke was lighter in daily life. They were mostly tax collectors and destroyers, not colonial administrators. They demanded tribute, the Yarlik tax, from the Rus princes, but otherwise left them to their own local customs. In fact, the biggest change was at the top. The Rus princes discovered their power now came from a distant Khan to rule it all. Each prince had to journey south to Sarai on the lower Volga, the new Mongol capital, north of the Caspian, to receive the Khan's patent, or Yarlik, confirming his titles. Only a prince with the Khan's blessing could be Grand Prince. Thus, the princes became vassals. They sent envoys and loads of coins east, and in return, were allowed to tax their own people and manage local affairs. The Khan even kept a say in succession disputes. As one historian notes, the prince's position was totally dependent on the good graces of the Khan. In Russian memory, the long era of Mongol domination gained a grim nickname, the Tatar Yoke. It would last for roughly 250 years. Under it, parts of Rus became tributaries of the Mongol Golden Horde. Culturally, however, the Tatars did not uproot Eastern Orthodoxy or impose Islam. The Russian Church largely continued its rituals. In fact, paying tribute to the Horde helped preserve the Russian faith from outside meddling. The greatest hero of the age, Alexander Nevsky R. 1252 to 1263, later said that by appeasing the Mongols, he saved the Orthodox Church while fighting foreign threats from the West. Alexander was a reluctant partner to the Horde, a born prince in hard times. As a young man, he had already seen Kiev's ruin and the death of his father. In 1240, when Novgorod's Swedish enemies marched down the Neva River, Alexander met them on that frozen water and won a stunning victory, earning himself the nickname Nevsky of the Neva. 2 years later, he even led the Novgorodian armies against the German Teutonic Knights and defeated them on the ice of Lake Peipus. These battles made Alexander into a near-mythic champion of orthodoxy and Rus liberty. Yet he recognized that the greater threat still lay to the east, took tribute terms from the Khan, and refused to anger the Golden Horde, which meant acquiescing to their overlordship so that Novgorod and the Church could live on. In this way, the Mongol era also indirectly fostered a singular Russian identity, one built on the Orthodox faith and distanced from Catholic Europe. Meanwhile, out of the chaos, a new center of power was quietly rising. One by one, the great southern cities were devastated or subjugated. But two northern towns survived and grew, Moscow and Tver. These places were fortunate. They lay in thick forests and along trade routes that the Mongols largely bypassed. As one traveler noted, Moscow and Tver were somewhat protected by forests, and both had favorable positions for trade. Many refugees from the devastated southern areas of Russia settled there. Think of frightened peasants, merchants, and craftsmen trekking north out of burnt villages. They often ended up in these quieter lands. Moscow, at first a small wooden fort town, saw its population swell. Though still minor during Batu's invasion, it was becoming a refuge. Over the 13th and 14th centuries, the princes of Moscow skillfully expanded their hold. Alexander Nevsky's son and namesake, Daniel of Moscow, even built the first church and monastery in the growing town. Moskva's rulers gladly took on the role of Mongol tax collectors and envoys. Earning the Golden Horde's trust, for example, Daniel's grandson Ivan I Kalita won the right to gather all Rus tribute. Gradually, this allegiance paid off. By the late 1300s, Moscow had emerged far more powerful than its neighbors. In fact, by the end of Mongol rule, Moscow had become the new center of Rus. One historian argues that, almost against all odds, by the end of Mongol rule, Moscow not only became the center of power, but also possessed the tools required to eventually control an empire that rivaled that of the Mongol Empire. In other words, the seeds of a Russian empire lay in that forest town long before it grew into a great city. Back in the immediate aftermath of the Mongol onslaught, the daily life of ordinary people was tough but recognizable. Peasants still harvested rye and raised their cattle, tied to their strip farming lands. Craftsmen still peddled pottery and candles at local markets. The Christian calendar still turned. Advents, Epiphany, Easter, church bells still chimed in villages. What had changed was the honor system. Instead of an old prince in Kiev or Vladimir, every news from the south now told of a Khan. It's the story of Alexander Nevsky, how he made the arduous journey to Sarai to meet the Mongol Khan, and returned with a Khan-s charter, was itself the stuff of legend. Even though the Tatars largely left villages alone, their influence lingered in public life. Princes wore their robes and Khan symbols, and sometimes a Tatar envoy would lurk at the prince's hall to watch. In time, though, the Mongol suzerainty began to fray. Russian princes learned how to exploit Mongol politics and Moscow's leadership. in particular, bolstered itself under the horde's nose. By 1380, a new Grand Prince, Dmitry of Moscow, felt strong enough to defy his overlords. He led a Russian army on the field of Kulikovo to defeat a Mongol Tatar army Mamaya's forces, striking a blow to the invaders' aura of invincibility, though tribute to the horde would still be paid for another century. This battle is sometimes considered the beginning of the end of the Tatar Yoke. By 1480, when Ivan III of Moscow refused the payment of further tribute and faced the horde's troops at the Ugra River, the yoke was finally shaken off. Looking back on this deep history from our 21st century vantage, we see the legacy everywhere. The once great city of Kyiv, now in independent Ukraine, carries ruins of its glorious past. Centuries-old cathedrals and stories that Russian, Ukrainian, and Belarusian cultures all cherish as their own. Each of those modern nations considers Kievan Rus its mother state. Even its name derives from Rus. Russia and Belarus are named after Rus. The Mongol period left a complex inheritance. It was a time of brutality, but also a crucible that forged new states. Moscow's rise under the Tatars set the stage for the Russian state. Yet the Orthodox Church and village communes kept an independent soul alive. Even in Ukraine, memories of the Mongol invasion are felt in folklore and cemeteries filled with mass graves. What does it mean today? Some say that Tatar Yoke isolated Russia, but others note it allowed Orthodox culture to flourish away from Catholic Europe. Certainly, that era disrupted the medieval Rus unity, but it also introduced new influences. Ultimately, the Mongols themselves partially Turkicized, and the Golden Horde would later convert to Islam. The deep chapter of Mongol conquest and the fragmentation it wrought lives on in many ways in the architecture. Ancient Kremlin walls in Vladimir and Suzdal, fortress churches outside Pskov and Smolensk. In the legend, St. Alexander Nevsky's cult still strong in Russia, and in the perception of Russian history itself. If there's a lesson, it's that Kievan Rus fell only because its leaders could not stand together. From Boris and Gleb to Yaroslav's wise treaties, its early years show what unity can build. The later centuries show how division can destroy. In the end, a new order rose from the ashes. Russia. In its first incarnation, under the princes of Moscow, different in character, but still believing itself heir to that ancient land and faith. The centuries of Tatar domination are long over, but their mark is in every tale of early Russia and in the very fabric of Eastern Slavic identity.
If you've enjoyed this journey through the fall of Kievan Rus, from Yaroslav's peaceful cathedrals to the Mongol horde's fiery conquest and the strange birth of Moscow's power, please hit subscribe, give this video a like, and let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for watching the deep chapter, and stay tuned for the next episode where we continue the story, how a lone city, Moscow, blossoms into a mighty grand principality. Until next time, Udaji and Proshai.